Thank you for having me here today. This is something of a challenge for me. I had a stroke last August, and when I get tired, I start slurring my words. If I start to become unclear, wave your arms and I will slow down and force myself to carefully articulate every word. My presentation today is about the racist roots of gun control, but that isn't the only motivation for such laws. Arms control laws have a variety of roots in many cultures, and even before the development of guns. These laws often existed to protect the political status quo by disarming the peasants. For example, in 1598, Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi ordered all, quote, swords, short swords, bows, spears, firearms, or other types of weapons, unquote, to be seized from farmers to discourage rebellion against the samurai who collected the taxes. The claim was that the goal was to protect the farmers from being encouraged to rise in a useless and bloody rebellion. Of course, within 2 centuries, the samurai were collecting 60 to 70% of the rice crop as taxes, and entire Japanese villages starved to death. This is also what started the practice of farmers selling their daughters into prostitution to be able to feed the other kids. Only World War II brought an end in part to this medieval system of power. Europe was no different in trying to control the lower classes. Henry VIII passed a ban in 1514 on crossbows and handguns, all guns less than 3 feet long, unless you met a property qualification. Theoretically, the goal was to encourage longbow practice because this was the weapon of the English army. The net effect was to limit practice of the new arms technology to the rich, and in subsequent centuries, hunting restrictions were often used to justify disarming peasants. France also limited bow possession by peasants because of fear after the Jacquerie Rebellion of 1358. Those writing for the upper classes argued that peasants should go on all fours like cattle and eat grass, and not be arrogant and wish for meat. Gun control in America has several roots, but race is the dominant one. America presented an interesting situation for a traditional English institution, the militia. The militia had always consisted of the freemen of the society, obligated to defend the realm from external attack and internal rebellion. By the time the American colonies formed, the militia had been replaced by professional soldiers in England. The American colonies revived the militia because professional full-time armies are expensive. The colonies faced 3 threats: Indian attack, invasion, and attack by foreign navies and armies, and as slavery became institutionalized in the latter half of the 17th century, fear of slave rebellion. By the start of the Revolution, every colony but Pennsylvania had a militia law requiring every able-bodied free man, usually aged 16 to 50, to be armed for militia duty and to turn out for militia musters or for combat. Most colonies experimented with laws banning sales of guns to Indians. Virginia actually made it a capital crime to travel more than a few miles from a settlement with more than 3 guns on the presumption that you were going to sell them to the Indians. These laws were generally unenforceable and largely disappeared by the Revolution. Slaves were another matter. Many, but not all, colonies prohibited slaves from possessing arms, including guns, clubs, swords, and dogs, which were considered to be weapons. Often slaves were allowed possession of weapons with the master's permission. Some colonies prohibited even the relatively rare free blacks from being armed. Often these disarmament laws were passed the same year that free blacks were prohibited from voting, such as Virginia in 1723. Courts have sometimes explicitly recognized this connection between citizenship and both the right and duty to bear arms. The Georgia Supreme Court, in upholding a special tax on free blacks in Savannah, drew all the rights of citizenship together. Quote, free persons of color have never been recognized as citizens. They are not entitled to bear arms, vote for members of the legislature, or to hold any civil office, end quote. Cooper and Worstrom v. City of Savannah, Georgia, 1848. As the Dred Scott decision of 1857 also explicated, if free blacks were citizens, quote, the Constitution would give them the full liberty of speech in public and in private upon all subjects of which its own citizens might speak, to hold public meetings upon political affairs, and to keep and carry arms wherever they went, end quote. After the Civil War, the struggle over black civil rights revolved, even before voting, around the right to self-defense against the Klan and less organized forms of intimidation. The silly robes and hoods aren't so scary with bullet holes in them. My paper, This Right is Not Allowed by Governments That Are Afraid of the People, the public meaning of the Second Amendment when the 14th Amendment was ratified, published in George Mason Law Review, was cited in the U.S. Supreme Court decision McDonald v. Chicago 2010 as evidence that Southern gun control laws were one of the reasons why the 14th Amendment used the phrase privileges or immunities to include the right to keep and bear arms. In the 1920s, many southern states found mail-order sales of handguns problematic because their own restrictive gun control laws could be so easily evaded by mail order, leading eventually to the Mailing of Firearms Act of 1927, which prohibited shipping handguns through the U.S. Post Office. This law is still in effect. In 1924, Senator Shields, Democrat of Tennessee, arguing for such a ban, explained that those sales made it hard to disarm black people. Quote, "Here we have laid bare the principal cause for the high murder rate in Memphis, the carrying by colored people of a concealed deadly weapon, most often a pistol." End quote. Last year, Charles Cobb's memoir of the Civil Rights Movement, "This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed," explained how guns made the Civil Rights Movement possible. The highly armed state of many civil rights activists kept the movement alive despite widespread domestic terrorism. He describes having trouble opening a door in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s house because there were so many guns stacked up behind the door. As part of this strategy, throughout most of its history, concealed weapon licensing was arbitrarily decided, usually based on race or more recently campaign contributions, and the reasons sometimes appear in the decisions of the courts. We have this astonishing statement from Justice Buford's concurring opinion in a 1941 Florida Supreme Court decision. Quote, "I know something of the history of this legislation. The original act of 1893 was passed when there was a great influx of Negro laborers in this state, drawn here for the purpose of working in turpentine and lumber camps. The same condition existed when the act was amended in 1901, and the act was passed for the purpose of disarming the Negro laborers and to thereby reduce the unlawful homicides that were prevalent in turpentine and sawmill camps, and to give the white citizens in sparsely settled areas a better feeling of security. The statute was never intended to be applied to the white population, and practice has never been so applied." End quote. Gun control based on race was not only aimed at blacks. California's current concealed weapon license law, currently in trouble before the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, was passed in 1923 as part of a bill that prohibited non-citizens, largely Chinese and Mexicans at that time, from possessing handguns and requiring background checks for handgun purchases. The KKK-endorsed governor signed the bill after a primary proponent of the bill explained in the San Francisco Chronicle that it would have a, quote, "salutary effect in checking tongue wars among the Chinese and vendettas among our people who are of Latin descent," end quote. At the time, Chinese immigrants were prohibited from naturalization, and millions of Mexican citizens had fled the Mexican Revolution into California. The replacement of the old-style discretionary permit laws in the 1980s and 1990s in most states has added enormous amounts of discrimination and corruption in permit issuance. Racism and gun control are not ancient history. 2 months ago, the primary fighter of gun control in the U.S., Michael Bloomberg, told the Progressive Aspen Institute that the focus of gun control should be minority men. Quote, "They just don't have any long-term focus or anything. It's a joke to have a gun. It's a joke to pull a trigger," end quote. Until 1967, California, like nearly all western states, allowed open carry of loaded firearms in cities. Oakland Police Department had a series of confrontations with the Black Panthers and asked for a ban. The Panthers showed their usual political intelligence by showing up in the legislative chambers heavily armed. This guaranteed fast approval on Governor Reagan's signature. The Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed by Congress after 2 summers of race riots across America. As even pro-gun control author Robert Sherrill admitted in his very entertaining book, The Saturday Night Special, the Gun Control Act of 1968 was passed not to control guns, but to control blacks. Even the term Saturday Night Special, to refer to cheap handguns preferred by criminals, appears to be derived from a term that was used up until the 1960s to refer to a drunken brawl in black sections. End town Saturday night. When California passed the nation's first assault weapons ban, the Roberti Roos Assault Weapons Control Act of 1990, while it was passed on the emotional reaction to a mass murder by a mentally ill drifter in Stockton, it was originally aimed at disarming inner-city drug gangs. I think it is no coincidence that this law, like many of its counterparts across the nation, was overwhelmingly focused on black guns, such as the AR-15, while exempting similarly functioning guns that were not black, like the Ruger Mini-14. Coincidence? I think not. All of this history has effects. Several generations of black men have grown up in societies where there was no lawful tradition of responsible gun ownership, either because it was essentially illegal like D.C. and Chicago, or the dominant media elite has influenced the population to see gun ownership as suspect, such as New York City, California, or New Jersey. This has an effect on how guns are perceived, and not in a good way. It means that lawful self-defense is questionable and creates a culture where the forbidden fruit of guns are attractive to the worst elements. If gun control has this history of association with what could best be considered reactionary racist thinkers, how did gun control become associated with liberal and progressive thought? Partly this was a response to the gun deaths of 3 icons of liberal politics, John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Gun control has become the default response of progressives because the alternatives to ask what has gone wrong in black urban culture. About half of all murders in the U.S. are black on black. Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown are actually very atypical black deaths in that they were killed by white men. Distracting attention from a culture of violence is just that, a distraction. At the core of the black violence problem is the absence of fathers in a subculture that idolizes violence, misogyny, and drug use. Partly also, the liberal and progressive thinkers are urban elites. By the 1960s, violent crime rates in cities with black populations had risen to intolerable levels. Rather than ask why this problem was concentrated in a group that the war on poverty is supposed to have helped, or confront their fears of young black men, it was easier to demonize guns. Where do we go from here? So what started out as racist hostility has now morphed into a real and very serious problem in black communities, and almost nowhere else. The northern tier of American states in the Midwest and Rocky Mountains have very relaxed gun control laws and yet lower murder rates in every case than their Canadian and Prairie Province neighbors, which have very strict gun control laws. The white non-Hispanic U.S. murder rate compares favorably to nearly every European country. Andrew Papachristos and Christopher Wildman of Yale have recently published a study that shows 6% of the population was involved in 70% of the murders, and that nearly all of those in the 6% already had some contact with the criminal justice or public health systems. Study after study find that not only murderers but their victims are overwhelmingly people with long criminal histories. Who your friends are is a bigger risk factor than race or poverty. Many people arm themselves as well because the criminal justice system does not protect them, and gun control laws utterly fail to disarm people who are prepared to commit murder, rape, and robbery. There is a very destructive subculture in which violence, misogyny, and drug abuse are a big problem. To solve this, and guns aren't an issue. It is always tempting to think that severe and often deeply embedded social problems can be solved by just passing some laws. The experience of gun control shows otherwise. Correcting serious cultural problems are slow and require widespread support. Cesar Beccaria was one of the major founders of the science of criminology in the 18th century. In his book On Crimes and Punishments, published in 1764, he observed that many laws are passed based on false notions of utility, that they will work regardless of reason. He observed that gun control laws were in that category. The laws of this, quote, the laws of this nature are those which forbid to wear arms, disarming those only who are not disposed to commit the crime which the laws mean to prevent. Can it be supposed that those who have the courage to violate the most sacred laws of humanity and the most important of the code will respect the less considerable and arbitrary injunctions, the violation of which is so easy and is of so little comparative importance? It certainly makes the situation of the assaulted worse and of the assailants better, and rather encourages and prevents murder, as it requires less courage to attack unarmed than armed persons. Thank you.